Hi, I'm Tom Payton, Director and Publisher at Trinity University Press, and welcome to the Maverick Book Club. The books we discuss in this series explore the rich stories and history of Texas. As a nonprofit, community-focused educational publisher, we're committed to an evolving agenda of work that engages, questions, and brings us together as a community in effective and productive ways. The nation and the world love San Antonio's Riverwalk. Louis Fisher's book, American Venice, the epic story of San Antonio's river, tells much of this story. We're delighted to have Louis with us tonight, but there is so much more to the story than meets the eye. Leading us in a discussion about the rich history and future of the Riverwalk is Claudia Guerra, cultural historian for the city of San Antonio. And joining Louis and Claudia in the conversation is Frates Seeligson, executive director of the San Antonio River Foundation, as well as Irby Hightower with Alamo Architects. What a great convergence of civic leaders, and thanks to them for joining us. You can purchase the book American Venice using the link you'll see in the chat box or at tupress.org and enjoy a 20% discount by using the promo code Maverick06 at checkout. Maverick Book Club series will be taking a break over the rest of the summer, but we will return in September to discuss the book West Side Rising, how San Antonio's 1921 flood devastated a city and sparked a Latino environmental justice movement by Char Miller. And for now, I welcome our friend Claudia Guerra. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to Trinity University Press for bringing us all together and facilitating this conversation. I'm excited to be talking to such esteemed friends and colleagues who I have worked with over the years. I know each of you loves San Antonio and nurtures and cares for it in a way that is to be honored. And so I'm glad to be here with you. And I think as Thomas already introduced us, I'm just going to do a little bit more of that. Tonight, we are featuring Louis Fisher, who is a beloved San Antonio historian, and as Tom said, author of American Venice. Frates Seeligson, who is the executive director of the San Antonio River Foundation and whose portfolio includes Confluence Park, along with many other enhancements and programs. And Irby Hightower of Alamo Architects, who co-chaired the San Antonio River Oversight Committee from 1998 to 2014, and was influential in the mission and museum reaches of the Riverwalk. You're welcome to send your questions to any of us via the Q&A mechanism on your screen, and you're welcome to chat with each other and with us. This is a conversation tonight, so we'll all be talking to each other, and Frates, Irby, and Louis, I also encourage you to not wait for me to ask questions of each other. Just jump in on the conversation. Let's just have a dialogue and a talk. Although I will start off with Louis, because this is in many respects about your book, American Venice, and because you really have set the foundation for the conversations that we have about the San Antonio River. And, I was thinking about it today and thinking about all the conversation that is happening right now about the Alamo. But frankly, there wouldn't be an Alamo if there wasn't a San Antonio River. That is what really gets San Antonio started. And so I thought I'd ask you, give us some of your thoughts on this vital water source and its beginnings, the first written records we have of the river, and any of that early history that you would like to share with us.
Well, basically, water is scarce in Texas, and rivers are great refuges for refuges for Native Americans to camp along and to fish in and retreat to in the heat of the summer. San Antonio, of course, was on the northern fringe of New Spain, and so when the Spanish got as far as the Red River up at North Texas, the French were nearby, and they started causing some problems with the Spanish, and they needed a place to, kind of a way station between the Rio Grande and the Red River. And so that is how the community of San Antonio was established here in San Antonio along the river, which gave a lot of life to the citizens and also to the crops.
So you're right, water is scarce. At the same time, we have an overabundance of it at times. Recently, we've had a lot of rain, and with that comes flooding, and that plays largely into San Antonio history as well. What can you tell us about flooding?
Well, the increased rains right now are not the sorts of problems they might have been in many cases a century ago, because our water table has lowered so much over the last 150 years as more people have required more water. So our springs don't flow like they used to, except in times of very heavy rains, and then we have to we can deal with the results, fortunately, much better now than we could not too many years ago.
Irby, I want to bring you into that conversation because you've talked about generations of stewardship that really go back to the late 19th century, if not before. So the idea of the Riverwalk as we see it now, whether it's for some flood control measures or the beautification of it, how does all of that sort of stewardship play into San Antonio's history with our water?
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful things in Lewis's book is to really outline how far back concern for the river goes, and that it really picks up when we start, pumping out of the aquifer. When there's heavy drilling equipment and the water table starts going down, and the river starts flowing less and drying up and getting overrun with vegetation, the people get alarmed that this beautiful asset is kind of disappearing and changing. And they immediately start having ideas about what to do about it. Like, how would you make the river back into what it was? How do you keep this asset? And one of the really wonderful things is wonderful stories about San Antonio that's really sort of, in many ways, we are kind of a world leader about this idea that you take something that's one of your biggest problems and you turn it into one of your biggest assets. And so in our case, it was to, I think, constantly rely on local people in the community and the grassroots efforts to figure out a better idea. And that began with the idea that the Riverwalk should be a park, that we should not make it into a flood control project to the extent that it just disappeared. And that was strongly championed locally, and they came up with a great solution. And it's one of the first, one of the few places at the turn of the century that has this idea of a flood control project that's also an asset to the city. And then you kind of see in the 1920s the idea about putting people down on the Riverwalk rather than it being something that you would look at. And that again is kind of a local effort. And we also saw what everybody else did done to the river, which is to plow it into a trapezoidal channel, which was terrible, both north and south of the Riverwalk. So we were brilliant, and then we were common and stupid. And I think from the very first time we were stupid, we also knew we needed to fix that. So I think no sooner than we had a flood control project done, the people started talking about what a terrible fix it was, and can we do something else? We've done, really amazing flood control projects, all of which have also created a great asset. So you've got Almost Dam, which creates a park there. We've got the Riverwalk, which creates a park. We have this flood control tunnel, which we don't see, but it does this amazing job of recirculating water downtown, so that we have no water most of the time, but we still have a flowing river because of a flood control project. And then we have way too much water every once in a while, and we have a good way of handling that problem as well. One of my sort of favorite numbers is historically, the rainfall in San Antonio is only 20% less than the rainfall in Seattle. The difference is all of our rainfall comes in like 2 or 3 days, usually in 2 or 3 hours on 2 or 3 days, and theirs comes over a 9-month period. So we are really world leaders in how you handle really difficult issues and make them into this fantastic linear park.
With that in mind, Louis, we almost didn't have a Riverwalk, right? We almost completely lost it had it not been for the visionary Robert Hugman. Can you tell us what our esteemed city leaders actually originally thought they wanted to do with this river?
Well, our esteemed city leaders originally wanted to have it just as a plain park. Once the water had dwindled about 1900, the river turned into what one commentator said was nothing more than a sluggish trickle through slime and silt. The citizens rose up at the idea of trees being cut and forced the city to think about it. And so in 1914, a river park was put in, which really wasn't too much. I mean, you couldn't put too much down at the level of a river that's going to flood out periodically and wash out. But they put trees and plantings, and it was all very pleasant and all very very bland until the Alamos Dam was put in and the extreme flooding was reduced, and Robert Hugman came up with a great idea to do a little bit more with the river and make it more than just a plain park and turn it into a sort of an ethereal wonderland of sorts with his exotic plantings and bridges and stonework and theaters and so on.
And the city had endured many floods. I mean, you go back to some of the original founding of the city and the original Alamo, which was not located where it is now, but more upstream along San Pedro Creek, and then had to be moved because of flooding. And then we saw subsequent floodings that caused a lot of damage and a lot of fatalities. And so can you speak a little bit, Louis, to the 1921 flood and how that really changed a lot of perceptions as well in the city?
Surely. Well, the city gets kind of a bad rap for not having done anything to prevent the 1921 flood. And they certainly had been dragging their feet for many decades. But right after 1900, there was a series of 3 or 4 floods that made the city realize they needed to do something. So they hired a consulting engineer from Boston in 1919. They came down, took a look at it, turned in the report to the city and said that, you know, you've got a problem here. You could have a serious flood. There'd been a serious flood in 1819. That was the previous one. And they said you could have another 100-year flood anytime. You better build a dam and straighten the river and do some things. And so the city thought that was a good idea. And as cities will do, took a little bit too much time, and sure enough, in 1921, there was a devastating flood. It was a hurricane that had started in Mexico and come up to San Antonio. And in those days, without weather reporting, you didn't really know what was coming at you like you do now. And so people just didn't have much time to get out of the way. And downtown was devastated. There was extreme damage in some of the lower income residential areas that were crowded along the creek, and more than 50 people drowned, and it was just a general catastrophe. And that got Alamos Dam moving pretty quickly.
And so what motivated Hugman to present his idea, and what did it originally look like? I mean, he had a vision for it. What was that?
Well, Hugman was a young architect. He had just come from New Orleans, and he was impressed with the way that the French character of New Orleans had been brought forth, and he thought that the Spanish character of San Antonio could be brought forth in a similar way. And he happened on the scene with his own plan, which was not immediately adopted until the 1930s, when a hotel owner by the name of Jack White said that this would be a good way to make the river look better beside his hotel. So he had the political clout to organize the funding mechanisms for the river, and hired Hugman and allowed Hugman to be as imaginative as he wanted to be, as he could be under the WPA plans that he presented, which lasted pretty well until About a year into the project, people decided that he was going a little bit too far, and he got fired. The problem was they couldn't take it back, because if they tried to return, get the WPA to take everything up, they'd have to repay the WPA. So his basic work was done and stayed in place, and a landscape architect took over and did mainly good plantings and enhanced it. And a year later, it was open.
And Frates, that speaks to a lot of your thoughts on the river and a lot of the work that you do, which is to continue revisioning it and have generations of San Antonians who really love the river and understand it to be the soul of San Antonio. What do you think about all of the people who have developed a stewardship for the river and their vision and their commitment to continuing the ever improving of the river?
Claudia, reading Lewis's book and just looking on the screen in front of me. I mean, there's Lewis and there's Irby. And I'm the most untenured of the three here, the most undeserving to be here. But the river, the stewardship's been generational, and and every generation has picked up and learned from the other generations. And it is. I look at what's happened in my span and the impact that it's had on the community, and not just the river, but the community, right, of San Antonio as a whole, and the connections between north and south and east and west. And we're using our creeks and our rivers as conduits for people to travel. And it's a charge that we all have, right? And it's a pride that every person from San Antonio, it's our river, right? And just reading, I mean, and Lewis did such a good job of chronicling the generations of this river, and it's incumbent upon us to carry it forward. And I'm new to the scene, and it's different than what it was before. The demands are different. Talking about the flow of the river, we used to have pump potable water into the river to have a flow. And we've learned that that's a bad idea, right? So now we can recycle water and pump that. And so as different issues come to the forefront of a generation, now it's climate change and its impact and its sustainability and its restoration. In the 20s, it was something different. It was more flood control. But it's amazing how our city has adapted and grown with their river to constantly steward it. So I love the fact that there's a quote in Lewis's book back from 1919. A gentleman who came to San Antonio is like, a stream, a creek, whatever it is in this environment is important, right? I mean, we don't have big rivers like out west, but we realize the importance of these creeks and these rivers, and we've valued them, and we've made mistakes along the way, but each generation has learned as they move forward, and to be a part of the continuation of rivers are living things. They change, and so does the community. So do the communities around them. And so it's great to see and be a part of all this. And I love the generational stewardship of the river.
And let's talk a little bit more of that. I want to get back to history, but I think what's happening with the river now and what may happen in the future and how it's all connected, I think is important. So part of the stewardship that you've been involved in is beautification to the south. We're very familiar with the downtown Riverwalk, which of course is historic and has its own sense of place and its own nature. But you've been involved in a lot of beautification to the south, including a lot of artwork that has been introduced. And I don't know if all of our audience has had a chance to see that or know what's happening in terms of the artwork that has been installed. Can you speak a little bit to that, Frates?
Sure. So, yeah, the mission reached the environmental restoration project moving south from downtown. The river in that part of the city is literally people's backyards. Yeah, and the stories I've been lucky enough to be a part of hearing families talk about how they went fishing with their grandfather, they caught fish, and then that was taken away, and we brought it back. And the connection in the historic missions was a historic tie to the river. They're there because of the fresh water that the river provided, and that connection got lost. So what the River Foundation has done is through the art portals, we're trying to reconnect the missions to the river and the river to the missions. And so as you are walking down the river, you can come to Mel Chin's piece, Coco Cobijos, and it makes you come up from the river to the top of the bank, and you pause, and then you see the beautiful towers of Mission San Jose. And so you're lured to go explore, and then you end up at the missions, and you can start having that connection and understand why the missions were here, and the role the river played in the development of the missions. And so the foundation is trying to use art as sort of like, the really attractive flower to attract the pollinator, but to attract the people to then go and learn and explore more about the history of our city. And so south we've done all 4 mission portals with enhancements with artists from Belgium and Houston and Philadelphia and El Paso. My favorite one is the last one at Mission Espada, which is the Alamo de la Vida, it's public art that the public participated in the process. So there's 700 pieces that hang from the city of San Antonio's Alamo de la Vida, which is the story of our city. There's 700 pieces that people from the community made. And yeah, and it heralds Mission Espada, but it also talks to our history and sited right on the river that brought us all here to begin with.
Can you tell us about one of the stories that's represented on the tree?
Okay. So my favorite story is the artist is a wonderful woman from Mexico that lived in El Paso, Margarita Cabrera, and she had a series of what she called charlas, which were conversations. And we were down in the Espada neighborhood, and there was a gentleman who was telling a story. He said, "Well, I want to make a ruler," and that seemed kind of odd, but like the peach ruler, the old days. And he said, "Well, I always heard my mother tell stories of when she went to school, because University Incarnate Word was located at Mission Espada. And the nuns would slap her knuckles with the ruler." And so those kind of narratives, Claudia, are just these beautiful stories of how we all ended up in this place. But it was so, I personally, I had no idea that UIW started down in Mission Espada. And then they moved up to where? To Headwaters. Right? So that university has been tied to the river the entire time. And, those kind of stories that it just brings a smile to my face.
I'd like to remind everyone that you are free to ask questions, so please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to your questions. Louis, building on what Frates talked about, our connection to the river, so he was talking about it, to reconnecting our current culture to it. And in some ways that connection never went away, but maybe we just didn't talk about it. But can you speak to the historical connection between the river and the missions and why they're located along the river?
Well, they are located along the river for the same reason that the city is. They provided water. If you'll notice, they sort of alternate. The southern missions, the 4 southern missions, alternate on either side of the river. They're about 2 miles apart. One's on the west side, then on the east side, and then it's on the west side. That's because there was no fencing in those days, and they didn't want the animals or their mission farms to stray into the pastures of another mission. But it's interesting what Freddie said about the way that the current development of the river, the Mission Reach, has reconnected the residents of the southern part of the city with the river. It had been just sort of in their backyard. There was something to be avoided. Now it's practically part of their front yards, and it's a great amenity for them to enjoy and to walk along. The same thing happened downtown as Robert Hugman's project got really into its full swing, where the residents at first had their bathhouses on the river, and in the 19th century they drank from the river, brought their water up from the river. Then they got running water inside, and the backs went onto the city. Backs went onto the river and back to the city above the river. But then, as Hugman's project got underway and became better used, the reverse happened. The basements started becoming the front doors for the stores above, and people started reconnecting to the river because of the sensitive development of Robert Hugman along downtown, just as it happened on the south side, and as it has happened on the museum reach of the north side. And I'll put in a plug here for our co-panelist, Irby Hightower, who was a co-chair of the Oversight Committee that actually saw the evolution and the development and the really imaginative work done on the museum reach, and I think the Mission Reach also. And it indicates what has happened in San Antonio in recent years. Governments can finance or are willing to finance just so much of a project, and you could get a very bland and simple commercial effort, say along the Riverwalk, along the museum reach. But when you have groups like people like Irby leading groups like the River Foundation to go out and bring in the extra private funding to give it that extra level of excellence, you have something that a city like San Antonio can really be proud of.
Yeah, and those are great points, Irby. I was about to come to you. So between Frates discussing, our current connections and Louis talking about historical connections, what was your role and what was the role of the San Antonio River Oversight Committee? And does it still exist? And does it still have a role?
No. So it does not still exist. The Oversight Committee was started in 1998. It was appointed jointly by the River Authority, the city, the county. And part of that was we had a little committee called the Ad Hoc Committee in 1996 that came up with some ideas, most importantly, fighting against what the city and the county were interested in doing on the south side, which was to kind of enhance the channelization, which we thought was a terrible idea, and kind of proposed an alternative to that. And a really smart guy on the committee, Ed Day, said, if you form a committee, no one will know that we're not official because the city, the River Authority, the county don't talk to each other. And it worked. We proposed it. The county thought it was a city idea, then they thought it was a River Authority idea, and then they finally realized it's just ours. And they got interested. And there'd been another committee similar to ours called Mission Trails Committee. And so they were comfortable setting this committee up. It was a very unusual structure. People were not appointed to it except for myself and Lila Cock was co-chairs, and 2 other people appointed. The rest of the committee was what was appointed were organizations. So neighborhood associations, Chamber of Commerce, the Catholic Church, property owner associations, and then each association group got to put on who they wanted to onto the committee. So we were fairly free of political interference. And they wrote the ordinances and things a little sloppily, so there was really no way to remove us. So we had to get all three organizations to agree to make a change. So we were able to just go along. And starting with coming up with a sort of a planning document of what we thought the community really wanted to see, and then going through the ideas of, we're promoting the idea of doing a master plan. And part of that was so we could break it up into funding parts and look for different funding from different places, because as Frida said, you cannot get funding from all one place these days. So we got private funding through the River Foundation. We've got hotel motel tax money through the county. That was one of the great breakthroughs. Again, came out of the committee. Someone on the committee went, I just read an article in the paper, and the city's paid off the bonds for the AT&T Center about 15 years early. And I think we need to go get that money for the river. And Lila Cockrell really led that effort. Sit down, the sort of proposal from the county was, we'll give you 75 million. And Lila sat down with Nelson Wolf and said, I think it's more like 150. So he agreed. And a lot of what we were able to accomplish was because we had local funding that was then being paid back slowly in the federal government through a Corps of Engineers. So it was really wonderful to be part of. It was all volunteers, and the committee stayed in existence until the project was finished. And Lila Cockrell said, I think it's really important that we say we've done it, we're finished, and then we go away. So the committee ended when the project was finished. And
what a great precedent you've set for us, and I think speaks to what both you and Frates have talked about in this idea of generational stewardship and funding, whether it's come from WPA, Works Progress Administration funding of the early 20th century, or current ways that cities fund projects like this. So so thank you very much for your leadership in that.
And I was going to just put a very quick plug in for this. So my background was a photograph I took about a week ago down by Mission Road, where it crosses the Mission Reach. And what I still can't really get over is this picture shows the project. This is about year 7 of it growing in. And the model is that it will continue to change for 50 years until at that point it becomes sort of a stable ecosystem. So every tree that you see in that photograph is about 7 years old. And there's another 43 years of change coming. Wow. So the most wonderful thing to me, the museum reach is fantastic. It was beautifully done by Fort Holly Carson. It's really a wonderful design, and it gets better all the time. But it's still a fairly static design, whereas the Mission Reach every year is kind of a new place. And the fact that it's kind of changing on its own and kind of designs itself is, I think, a really wonderful thing to watch.
And that's a great segue to talking about the future. But before we do that, we do have a question for anyone who would like to answer this or can answer it. Is what was O'Neill Ford's role, if any, on the Riverwalk or associated projects?
I'll take part of that question, and Liz may have a better thing. Fort Powell Carson had were the lead designers for the museum reach. During O'Neill Ford's lifetime, it was really Boone Powell, not O'Neill, that had the big impact, because O'Neill and Cy Wagner co-chaired the local AIA effort to kind of counter what had been proposed, which was to do this sort of almost an amusement park along the river. And it was their counter, which was, let's keep the existing buildings, let's take what Hugman did. And actually what they didn't even exactly know they were coming up with was to do Hugman's idea, which is to open the buildings up to the river. They had a very different idea about the architecture of that. But you could dig out the crawl spaces, make them habitable, and do what really became this very distinct Riverwalk architecture, because it's the back of buildings that are then kind of amended, added onto, transformed, so that they're almost like garden facades more than like street facades. And one of the things we've tried to hold on to over the years is trying to get new buildings where the riverside isn't like a formal street facade, but it's more of a garden facade, a little more informal, a little lower scale. It's really hard to get the scale right in San Antonio. And I think that's an ongoing effort with the city, HDRC, to make sure we get things scaled appropriately to the river, the Riverwalk.
Right.
Elizabeth probably knows more, but that my understanding is really it's more about Joy Boone Powell had more of an effect than Neil had in what we see today.
Did you want to add to that, Louis?
I would add simply that that Irby has been explaining one of the very unique characteristics of San Antonio's Riverwalk, and that is that it has been spontaneous. That when you walk along the Riverwalk, it does not look planned, because it wasn't. Nobody really intended to put up a building that looked one way or another. It just sort of happened. And then when the Riverwalk came along, everything was in place. And it really keeps San Antonio's Riverwalk unique, because other cities that go into walks along the river cannot really duplicate that sense of spontaneity that you can enjoy here in San Antonio.
Louis, Matt, Claudia, I'm sorry, but yeah, I'm curious if you can elaborate, like when David Strauss in the 60s was trying to get the landowners in the Riverwalk to be river facing. Yeah, because that was a lot of your book talks about how it was the back of the buildings, right? And whether, and similarly, with the river improvements project that we just did, we turned our backs to the river and the creeks. We saw them as just some kind of a flood control project, and then to Irby's point about the mission reach, the citizens invested. We could have put $125 million to potholes, but we chose to put it to the river. And I mean that shift in focus. And in your book, Louis, you did a great job of talking about how David had to go and convince the property owners that this was an asset and not something to turn your back to. And I think that kind of that paradigm shift in like looking at the river, it's not something that we dispose of, we put our waste in. It's a valuable asset. And that it seems to me that was a kind of a big seminal moment when private landowners along in the bend in downtown realized that this was an asset and not something that just you turn your back to.
David Strauss, indeed, is one of the great heroes of the Riverwalk. He was fighting an uphill battle. He was coming along in the early mid 1960s when Hugman's Riverwalk was still pretty much not drawing many people. It was almost dead. The Riverwalk couldn't draw more people because there were no businesses on the Riverwalk. And what David Strauss faced was businessmen who said, well, why should we have a business along the Riverwalk when there are no people along the Riverwalk? And so he was able to get a little momentum, but his efforts came at the same time as the local chapter, Cy Wagner and others of the American Institute of Architects chapter here in San Antonio, came at the same time that Hemisphere, our World's Fair, developed in 1968. All of a sudden, with Hemisphere and with hotels that were built along the river and also opened onto the Riverwalk, all of a sudden we had the people. So river businesses who would be based perhaps in the river above, along the streets above, could open on the Riverwalk. It was feasible to open on the Riverwalk because there were people, and the more businesses there were, the more people came. And that has been something that has almost made the Riverwalk a victim of its own success, in that we don't want to have too many chains spreading door to door on the Riverwalk, but the balance has still been more or less kept.
I want to get to some of the other questions we have. So, Frates, could you speak to the 2013 flood and the mission reaches initial damage and quick recovery?
Oh, well, Irby might be able to speak better to that. The 2013 flood was while the mission reach was still under construction, and it blew out the whole, the confluence of San Pedro Creek and the San Antonio River. It's interesting, the West Side Creeks, the watershed in that area at where they come together, where San Pedro Creek comes together with the San Antonio River, it's a bigger watershed. So you go there during a big storm, San Pedro Creek is a much bigger influx of water than the San Antonio River is. And now with the tunnel, that's even, that's why it's been controlled. And Irby, you're welcome to weigh in, but I believe a lot of the vegetation hadn't had a chance to establish. There was a lot of equipment and construction material that ended up blocking and causing the flooding down further south, like on Symphony Lane and those neighborhoods. And it was an effect of the fact that we hadn't completed the project, and the rains came at a very inopportune time.
Sort of worst possible time.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big costs for doing any kind of flood control project like this, any big river project, is that the contractor has to factor in that it's going to rain and wash things out. And the museum reach was built, it was one of the wettest times we've ever had. It was like an extremely wet year. And Zachary Construction had come up with some really, really innovative, interesting ways to keep their work area dry. They spent millions in a whole system of ways of dewatering that part of the work, which they could just in a couple of hours completely dry it out and be back working. On the museum reach, on the mission reach, basically had to build an alternate river. So you had to divert all the water flow over into a new channel that operated daily while you did the construction, and you put it back where the new construction was. Well, that works unless there's a flood. And it was a historic level of flooding that time. And everything, the project was almost finished. And plans were being established. They had just like seeded areas, and it just scoured everything from about a third to halfway up the channel down, just out. So the project had to be, the opening had to be delayed. Everything had to be replanted. There was some stuff that was just sort of concrete, stonework, all sorts of stuff that was just ripped out because the plants are integral into how the whole system works. And when the root systems aren't in place to hold everything there, then that actually is part of the structure. So water was able to get in behind things that were hardscapes and just rip them. So it was devastating.
And it did.
But Zachary was a big plug for them as a construction company. They came back, put everything back really quickly. And as you can see in my picture, it's doing great.
And Irby, I do want to make this point clear that, what we've proven with the River Improvements Project and the Mission Reach, which is a flood control project, is that you can have environmental restoration and flood control.
Right.
It's not an either or. And this unfortunate flood created some press that said, "Oh, you can't." And now that it's complete and it's vegetated and the fauna is coming and holding the soils, we have proven you can have flood control and environmental remediation and restoration at the same time. And that's the model that San Antonio has proven that every cities across the world are looking at and saying, how did you do this? And we're like, you can't have both. And so the 2013 flood was I'm very unfortunate, but it doesn't diminish the fact that we've proven the model once the native species are established. It just was bad timing.
Yeah, and it's one of those things you kind of know might happen, and you build it into the cost, and you build it into the model of how you're going to do it, and it worked. In the end, it worked fine. It worked great. The other thing that has been really interesting to watch, it was really important about the mission reach, was really figuring out how to get. This is a very large project in terms of reestablishing native species in an urban environment. And it's difficult to reestablish native species in a more natural environment. There's great work. Texas ranchers have done a great job, especially the big ranchers, of reestablishing native vegetation. But this is in the middle of a city where every time it rains, every seed that is in everyone's backyard or front yard washes into the river. So every invasive species that has ever been planted in San Antonio ends up in the river, and coming up with a kind of mixture of actually harsh conditions that don't allow non-natives to establish, and the right amount of ways to sort of nurture native species has been a really interesting problem that the project has managed to solve.
Not to mention they come with a lot of fertilizer.
A lot of fertilizer. And of course, as we all know, a lot of plastic bottles, but a lot of fertilizer.
Related to things that end up in the river, during construction and over tens of thousands of years, lots of things wash up and lots of things are found, interesting archaeological finds. Were there any interesting findings during construction of the Mission Reach?
Yes.
Are they things that, I know sometimes, if being in this field, I know we can't always reveal everything. Is there anything, Irby, that can be revealed tonight?
It is a rich archaeological site. And there were, I think, wonderful discoveries that reinforced the idea that people had been living along the river for at least 10,000 years. And also that those people were had a little better technology than we thought. So it was really wonderful sets of discoveries.
That's great. And just for everyone, I mean, we can't always reveal the location, what was found or the location until we know it can be properly protected. So not trying to be evasive, but that's partly what's happening.
Claudia, I could talk about something that was found that we can talk about. And it was on the museum reach. And Irby, I think you remember, by the Lone Star Brewery, which is SAMA, there was a layer of glass where in the old days they would toss the glass into the river as the broken glass, and it made a whole a layer, like sedimentary rock, right? But it was a layer of broken glass, and then there was another one at the Pearl, and it was just I actually asked the project coordinator Mark Sorensen if I could have a box of each, and it's I would love to create an art piece with them, and talk about how a generation ago they just threw the broken bottles in the river, but it's not archaeological find, but it is a turn of the century glass. It's beautiful, and they just threw it in the river.
It just shows to how people have interacted with the river for so long. And thinking of interactions, and 'cause I know we're going to run out of time soon, but let's look forward. And here's a question that I really know nothing about, so I'm hoping one of you can answer. What do you think about the Great Springs project? Is it feasible or possible?
It's a great project. And I think Frates knows some about it too. People in my office have been real active in doing some volunteer work for it. And the idea is to connect sort of a hike, bike, trail, and environmental trail, camping, all sorts of great ideas from the springs in San Antonio, basically from San Pedro Springs to Barton Springs in Austin. And for that trail to go to connect each spring that's all along the Balcones Escarpment, so that people will have an appreciation for all of those, that entire ecosystem, and also as a way of preserving that property. So it's looking at how can you come in and do environmental easements and other ways of protecting it, and also as an economic generator to help pay for those easements and overlays and all that. So it seems easier than it should be. So I think it's highly doable. Frates, what do you?
I was approached. I've been working with Deborah and Carrie for over a year now. I think it's a great project. It's our own Texas Appalachian Trail, kind of. And in a long way, it goes back to this whole idea that I feel is so important, is that we're all connected by our rivers and our streams. And if you can have this conveyance where people from different cities and different neighborhoods are, they're connected, and we're all part of the system. And I think it's an ambitious plan, but as one of the gentlemen who's working with them, we always dream big in Texas, and so why not do this? And it is, but part of it is the Bexar County parts of it. The Spirit Reach needs to get done, connecting the river to the Blue Hole. We need to keep funding the Greenway trails. They all are part of it. And so it's going to be a county by county initiative. Great Springs is the overarching effort, but we need to do our part, because I think it would be an incredible asset for future generations.
River Road is, there are some planned environmental restorations along River Road. What kind of thoughts do you all have about that?
This is one of those where I don't know what the current plans are, but doing the restoration was certainly part of the original project. I think it's great to do it. It is another place where there is this balance between so many conflicting interests and goals that it's a little hard sometimes to figure out the exact right balance. One of the issues is that piece of the river is also very high sort of birding habitat, and it's a high birding habitat because there are birds of species that don't normally stop in San Antonio that stop there, and some of that possibly is because the environment is not quite native and right. So it's one of these many things where you have to look at the whole balance of, when you say environmental restoration, what are you really trying to accomplish? And given the careful balance you have to do, is it possible that you might accidentally disturb the environment that you actually think you're trying to protect? So it's a tough one.
Claudia, we know the erosion of the bank needs to be addressed, but it is the last, and Irby, and correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe it's the last untouched native stretch of the river that's still somewhat wild. And so I think the project review and the exploring the restoration needs to go forward. But they also, I think it's critically important that the River Road neighborhood has a voice in how it moves forward. But the pressing issue of erosion on the bank it needs to be addressed, and that's in everyone's best interest.
And there are invasive species, native plants along that area also that are changing the way it looks. And I think that speaks to what Irby was discussing as well.
There are a lot of invasive species. Some of those may be actually something that may be doing some benefit. It's a tough question.
Yeah.
And there are other issues that make it difficult too, even in historic preservation of all things, that gets in the way, because one of the low water crossings across the river at that point was built by the National Youth Administration, the NYA, in the Depression. And there is even a stretch of pavement on which NYA is engraved. So that is an historic landmark. Yet it is also very much in the way of the ecological restoration of that section of the river, because it blocks the flow of the water and creates problems for the fish and plants. And so that's something you have to swallow hard on.
Yeah, and not to mention the affection for place that people have for it, and not to dismiss that sense of place at all. So, you know, we're getting close to ending, but I wanted to ask each of you to give me your thoughts on the future. And this could be, you know, from, as Lewis was just talking about, how does historic preservation affect the river? But it could also be from a climate change perspective, because I know that's one of the things that all cities are thinking about in terms of water. But just, you know, a couple of thoughts on the future of the river. Maybe I'm looking at my screen, so maybe we start with Lewis.
Well, I think we have a risk of falling into the trap of everything's up to date in Kansas City. We've gone about as far as we can go. And we just sort of sit back and think, well, there's nothing more that can be done. It's been done. And at this point in time, it may seem that it has been, but I think maybe even, you know, another year or two, we have to keep our minds open for what other improvements can be made.
Yeah. Irby?
Yeah, and to Lewis's point, the master plan for the Mission Reach actually has an additional trail the entire distance that was not built because of funding. So there are lots of things that are still just unfinished in the original thing. You have to constantly, you can never sit back and relax. But the wonderful thing about the river is it's this sort of great skeleton that you can hang all sorts of wonderful things on, and for it to continue to grow and to have projects that suck it into it. It's not just about the river project. I think the other quick shout out I would have for the Mission Reach is that what you see that feels like it's the Mission Reach is actually a collection of multiple projects that all, again, because it's sort of a grassroots thing, we're all able to come together at the same time and really make this transformation. And that kind of next generation of socketing projects onto it is what we need to do. And there will always be the next project and sort of the next transformation. And I'm absolutely sure in 50 years, everybody will go, they got this environmental restoration completely wrong. We really need to go in now and really make it right. So there will always be improvements.
I think that's true. It's always about managing change, as we say in historic preservation. So, Frates, would you like to round us out and end with some thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm excited. So the Confluence Park was one project I worked on, and you know, we've had 38,000 students come through there since we opened, and to see them reconnect with their river and start understanding that, and I spoke earlier about, we talked about this generational stewardship. I'm excited to see what they do. As Irby said, it's always changing. There'll always be another project. And, you know, let's link our city. I mean, you know, people in Stone Oak need to understand they're linked to the river. You can get on Cibolo Creek and you can connect to the river. You can get on Leon Creek and you can connect to the river. We're all connected. And it's to empower the next generation you know, I think we're in a good spot.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to end. And it's kind of where we started in a way. It was just this idea of generational stewardship and the new stewards that we have. To our city, because clearly we're a city that was founded along the banks of the river, and it's really important to continue our city thriving. So thank you all for the stewardship that each of you does for the river. I think it's vital, and I and all the citizens appreciate it, and hope you keep doing it, and can't wait to see what you come up with next. For everyone who joined us tonight, thank you for listening. I hope we got to all of your questions. And thanks for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, and especially thank you for Trinity University Press for bringing us together. If you'd like to purchase a copy of American Venice by Lewis Fisher, let me give you some quick instructions here. Visit tupress.org for 20% off. Use out 06, I should say. Maverick will be taking a break over the summer, but we will return in September with the book West Side Rising: How San Antonio's 1921 Flood Devastated a City and Sparked a Latino Environmental Justice Movement by Chard Miller. To stay informed, sign up at tupress.org for their newsletter. And thank you all again, and good night, everyone.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank